Hello and welcome to the ERP Organizational Change Journal podcast, brought to you by Nestell & Associates. Nestell & Associates is an ERP organizational change management firm serving the private equity industry. I'm your co-host, Jonathan Donald, the founder of Invert Ventures, a change strategy firm, and I'm here with my friend and colleague, Dr. Jack Nestell, the founder of Nestell & Associates, and the host of the ERP Organizational Change Journal podcast. The ERP Organizational Change Journal seeks to share expertise, insight, and create effective conversation to help guide ERP organizational change to real, measurable, and verified success, expanding what we can see so we can act in a more effective way. We seek to promote, connect, and foster relationships in the ERP organizational change community. The primary purpose of this podcast is to discuss, share, and reflect upon effective and efficient ways in which to realize ERP organizational change success. We will discuss the people, process, and technological components of ERP organizational change. This podcast is intended as a forum to study, share, and discuss ERP organizational change. It's our intention for this to be a collaboration tool and resource. We hope that you find this podcast useful as we share lessons learned, discover best practices, and explore the human elements and components of ERP organizational change. Our podcast draws on knowledge from extensive research, collaborative learning, practitioner experience of both project successes and project failures. A general review of the themes of ERP and organizational change practice, literature, and research suggests that understanding and critically having an awareness of tactics founded in principle is fundamental to ERP organizational change success. Our podcast will discuss these tactics, explore these approaches, and discover the principles that they are founded upon so that they may prove to be useful in addressing ERP organizational change challenges and risks.
Thank you, Jonathan. I'm always so excited and looking forward to fun conversations with you and our guest. We seek to promote, connect, and foster relationships in the ERP organizational change community, as we are a podcast that desires to engage in valuable insight into the world of ERP organizational change success with interviews and roundtable talk. Our guests include experts and pioneers in the field, organizational stakeholders, practitioners, and researchers. Our podcast is a platform for those seeking to share, learn, and reflect on ERP organizational change success.
In this episode, Organizational Transformation, the Keys to Success, we're joined with Mr. Joe Choorapuzha, who will help us explore successful organizational growth and transformation. Joe is a partner at Incline Equity Partners, is headquartered in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and is a private equity firm investing in manufacturing, distribution, and business service companies. Incline's typical investments are ownership transition for privately held businesses, buyouts, and corporate divestitures within the U.S. and Canada. Joe also currently serves as the director of FDL Cold Logistics, Profile Products, and Foundation Source. Joe is an expert in opportunity evaluation and developing growth strategies. He's responsible for evaluating, analyzing, and monitoring investments made by Incline Equity Partners. And Joe has led investments in multiple businesses within the manufacturing, franchising, and distribution space. Jack, I'm really excited for our conversation with Joe today.
Likewise, Jonathan. I'm looking forward to it. Well, thanks, Jonathan. In this episode, we will explore the processes, leadership, challenges, and benefits around successful organizational transformation and ERP organizational change. We will dive into sustainable performance outcome, alignment of people, processes, and technology, the real value of ERP, the definition and vision of ERP success, ERP implementation risk, and attributes of successful organizational change leadership, and much more. Private equity and ERP organizational change have a lot in common, the most important of which is helping to support organizational stakeholders by endorsing and advocating for a healthy and vibrant organization. Joe, Jonathan, and I are thrilled to have you on the show today.
Thank you, Jack. Thank you, Jonathan. Really looking forward to this, and I appreciate your having me.
You bet. not only as a practitioner in the private equity sector, but as an ERP organizational change researcher for many years with a focus on PE, I've had the opportunity to interview hundreds of private equity partners, formally and informally. And I've been grateful for rich discussions and perspectives because everyone's experience is extremely relevant and insightful to the practice of ERP organizational change in general. And it is through sharing and collaboration that the field of ERP organizational change will continue to advance. I believe that objective research and professional systematic inquiry and its results and applications is a powerful tool. And ultimately, this podcast is dedicated to the success of PE firms and, most importantly, their portfolios, and even more importantly, their people. So myself and the NNA team enjoy examining the executive stakeholders' perspective in terms of promoting and advocating for organizational transformation success. Joe and Incline partners have and continue to realize great success. So let's pick Joe's brain and probe and see what we can learn. All right, Joe, let's dive in. The first question for you that I'd like you to share with our listeners, if you would please, is how would you define the value of private equity for our listeners? Or ask another way, what is the value that Incline Equity Partners brings to its portfolio companies?
Yeah. Jack, thank you for that. Appreciate the question. It's a question that, believe it or not, we get asked relatively frequently. As we think about investing in businesses, a lot of the times it has been owned by a founder, an entrepreneur, or a different private equity firm. And in those scenarios, we at Incline Equity, we invest in healthy, growing businesses, and we look to invest in businesses that have reached an inflection point in their growth and are looking for a new way to kind of ramp up their growth, accelerate it, or otherwise change that trajectory for the better of their growth path. And so we'll look at a business and say, let us understand what you've done, and then let us share with you what we've done with our other portfolio companies and see if it's relevant and applicable to your experience. So what that means at a more practical perspective is oftentimes we'll look at a business that has scaled to a certain point. Maybe it's grown from being a local to a regional business. And to take that next step from being regional to national, they're going to have to do something different. They'll have to bring on more talent. They'll have to potentially look at acquisitions. They might need to look at new products, new services. They might need to revamp operations, right? They've gotten to a point where they've reached the end of the rope, potentially, for what the current infrastructure can support. Sure. And that's where we come in. We have a ton of experience bringing in people, bringing in, the tools and the infrastructure. Probably one topic that will be very relevant for today is, the technology type tools that are needed for businesses to grow. And so that is how we differentiate ourselves. And that's the value we try to bring to our portfolio companies.
Joe, so what I'm hearing is when you're talking to these companies and looking at supporting their growth, some of this is organizational performance improvement, and that requires some level of change. And sometimes this change can be rather significant. And sustainable performance outcomes really only occur when the organizational culture continues to transform, align with people, process, and technology. And in my experience, that's often easier to say than it is to achieve. Joe, when I look at Incline Equity's website, you say it right on your homepage. We do things the Incline way. Our private equity team is powered by passion, driven by people, and collaborative with our partners. We blend strategic experience and creative thinking with hard data to advance a business. When I hear that, what I think you're saying is that transformation requires the development and alignment of people, processes, technology, and culture with the organization's mission, vision, and values. Does that capture the Incline way? And can you tell us more about it? And if so, where does this emphasis come from as powered by passion, driven by people, and collaborative with our partners?
Yeah, Jonathan, you are spot on. We've had a very nice run over, the last 2 decades, investing in a lot of different businesses, close to 50 businesses at this point. And one of the things that we believe in is that we, as a private equity sponsor, we're not responsible for the success of our portfolio companies. That credit lies with the teams who actually run the businesses. And kind of, looking back to the prior question, the way that we support that success is by giving those teams the tools to succeed. And, as we think about that success being driven by people, process, and technology, right? Like I kind of want to look at each of those individually.
Go ahead.
We interact directly with the management teams. So success, right, starts from the bottom up, but the culture takes its lead from the top, and that comes from the management team. And our perspective is that culture really drives so much of what an organization can accomplish. So when we look at a management team and we look at the strategy for growth, we say, where can we add? Has the team thought about, advancement of people, succession planning? Are there things that we need to do to make sure that the best performers are expanding their role and growing into a place where they fit best? Do we have the infrastructure, right? The people infrastructure to support the next 5 or 10 years of growth? And even more importantly, how do we know?
Yeah, right.
One of the things we've learned, when we invest in businesses, oftentimes the companies will focus on, their product or their service, but they're not focused on the people and the development of people, right? That HR function, the people development, the performance evaluation. That's a critical area where we like to invest our time and effort. Then you also asked about process. We firmly believe in analyzing process. I'll give you an example. So when you take a look at a business and you say, let's take a look at their operations. Well, what key performance indicators are they tracking? Are those the right KPIs? How are they tracking them? And, what are the targets they're looking at, right? Because just tracking something isn't enough if you don't have a goal. Mm-hmm. And then you say, the people who are in charge of delivering those KPIs, or do they know what we're tracking? Are they aligned? It goes beyond operations. Like, on the sales side, you look at customers. How are we looking at our pipeline? How are we moving customers through the sale process? What's our go-to-market strategy? So on the process side, it's always, let's take a look and say, are we doing things the right way? Do we have the right data? How can we rely on the answers we've come up with? One of our internal sayings is, in God we trust, all others bring data, which, that lends itself really to the technology part of the equation, right? In fact, people, process, technology. A lot of companies can produce data. The quality of that data is what differentiates between company A and company B. Yeah. We find that it can be very challenging to make good decisions without good data. So just to give that a little bit of structure around that, you have sales, you have operations, you have finance. These groups kind of have a natural tension, right? I mean, sales wants to get product out the door. They want to, make sure there's plenty of inventory. They might care less about pricing, right? They're just trying to get things out the door. Operations, wants to level load. They want to optimize efficiency. They want to minimize overtime, all that kind of stuff. And finance is managing cash, maximizing profitability, minimizing liability, right? Everyone has a sort of a different desired outcome.
Sure.
And so having the good data to understand, okay, what are the goals we're aligning around? How are we making sure we're getting there? And how are each of these 3 different groups sort of focused on driving the right outcomes so that we're achieving our goals? All of that relies on technology that lets the groups talk to each other.
So what I'm hearing here is that even though they're all 3 separate parts, Joe, they're integrated and holistic in that they affect each other in real time, just by the way you're describing this.
You couldn't have said that any better. I wholeheartedly agree.
That's great insight, Joe. And I like how you mentioned the fact or provide insight on the natural stakeholder group dynamics and natural tensions. I think that's such a critical and insightful point. So, Joe, during an organizational transformation, I think that anyone in the business for long enough knows that perfection is often not a reality and really not an honest expectation. But I think what is a reality and expected is not necessarily trying to prevent any and all issues and challenges. Perhaps that could be impossible. But what is as important is to handle those issues when they do occur, handle them properly by knowing and addressing the root issues when they do rise to the surface. Is that a fair statement?
Jack, I mean, that is spot on. Anyone should realistically know that there are going to be some hiccups. It's inevitable. But having that organizational buy-in on the initiative, minimizing workarounds, making sure that everyone is saying, I'm going to invest the time and effort up front to do this right, that's the best way to mitigate the risk and to maximize success. And then as issues do bubble up, having, a partner who, whether that's, folks like us who've been through this many times, folks like yourselves, right, who have done this many times, who then can say, okay, I get the issue, I know how to solve it, and I know how to make the fix so that we can, manage any subsequent repercussions. That's the critical aspect.
Yeah, I think that's well said, Joe. I think the idea is, you, and I know that you and your team does at Incline, but you work very hard to put together a, dot I's and cross T's, and you have that plan and you work for perfection. But then just as important is that culture that can react to issues and challenges when they do arise. So I think that's such a critical point.
I want to follow up on your prior comment around natural tension, because that applies in my mind to more than just the organization. So do you see any natural tension in the value trade-off between effective and efficiency during ERP or another technology organizational transformation effort? And if so, how do you view that? Yeah,
that's a great point, Jonathan. Effective, right? When I think effective, and this almost goes back to the tension between, as an example, sales and operations. If you think about, sales might say, we want to be efficient and get this done as quickly as possible. And operations might want to say, we want to be effective and get this done correctly in every single way. There's a little bit of you're never going to get every single thing right. You want to balance the time and the costs associated with implementation with getting it done right so that you're not impairing the business. And that, at the end of the day, becomes a judgment call that, the management team, the executive team needs to make. There is that tension. I think for us, every value lever we pull requires some, you have to make decisions with limited information. You don't always know the answer, but you need to kind of see the whole picture with what you have at hand and know when it's time to say, okay, we've done enough work, we've done enough analysis, it's time to move forward and execute. And I say that's right. No different with an implementation effort.
So, Joe, what do you find to be the main or most common ERP organizational change and or business intelligence challenges during a new acquisition?
That's a good question. Just on the ERP front, I think the two things that jump to mind. First is culture, and as part of culture, I'd say sort of the sub-point is adoption. So we've worked with a lot of businesses, especially the founder-owned businesses. People have been doing something a certain way for a long time, and getting folks to break habits and get past that and understand there's going to be some friction, and changing things might actually be more inefficient at the outset, but it'll be better in the long run. That is key for having an organizational buy-in on saying we're going to do this. It's going to be a challenge, but the end result is going to be worth it. The second piece I would say is in terms of challenge. And this one's a little bit more nebulous, but it's kind of scoping out the goals of the organization and getting alignment across the board. It goes hand in hand with culture, but everyone's going to have a different goal. Everyone's going to have a different desire, perspective for what we need to come of the implementation or the organizational change. And kind of getting everyone rowing their boat in the same direction and saying, well, yes, we're all aligned, right? I'm not getting every single thing on my wish list, but I prioritize my list. I'm getting, 3 of the top 5 things, and that gets us to our 80-20 so we can get this done effectively and efficiently. That's where it is. That's where the key is, where everyone's happy, everyone gets it, and everyone's moving in the same direction to get it done.
So, Joe, can you provide our listeners with maybe a tactical example that you can use to break the tension and to gain more buy-in? Do you have any tactical insight you can offer up on that point?
That's a great question. So I'll give you an example. We have a business service company. The sales folks are motivated by driving additional sales, and they have historically been compensated only on sales growth. The operations folks, they're tasked with customer retention. Once the sale is done, the customer moves from sales to ops, and they're tasked with keeping the customer. So there's a natural tension between the two, because sales thinks, hey, I'm going to sell the world, right? We're going to deliver all kinds of great things from a service perspective once they're in the door, and cares less about what happens after the fact. And operations says, hey, I'm going to vet the crap out of this customer, and if I think we've overpromised and we're going to underdeliver, I'm going to push pricing, push whatever I can to make sure that we get alignment up front, that we can deliver what we said we can. There's a natural tension there. And that was the state of play when we invested in the business. So what we tasked ourselves was saying, well, why don't we actually align these goals? So let's have sales have a metric where it's not just driving the sale in the door, but it's also there's a retention metric associated. It's probably 80-20 still, right? You still want them to focus on driving the sale,
Sure.
but you want them to have some kind of tail exposure to keeping that customer on board. And operations, same thing, right? Yes, we want you to keep the customers, but we want the service to speak to new customers coming on and driving sales growth through word of mouth. So you just align those incentives. It sounds, like motherhood and apple pie, but this stuff works. Right?
That's a great example. Yeah.
And then, you see it changes behaviors and it gets the organization aligned.
Yeah, exactly. Great example.
Joe, great example. I just want to highlight this for our listeners. So when I'm hearing that example, you recognize the cultural tension between sales and ops. You decided that the system of compensation, in this case with the metrics by which they were being compensated, could be adjusted so that they would be more aligned to working for the organization's benefit rather than the function. And so by changing that system, you're hoping to support changes in behavior and ultimately how they're working for function rather to work for their organization. Is that really what you're going after? Does that make sense?
Yeah, Jonathan, you encapsulated that perfectly.
Joe, it's really easy because you're just nailing them. It's just the example's so crystal clear. So you're making my job on the podcast really easy. I want to ask you here, changing gears a little bit, what would be your definition of success and your visioning process of success for both the companies you invest in and you as a PE firm? Speak to that natural tension as well if that arises.
It's a very good question, and here's how I think about it. So as a private equity investor, our investors, right, the folks who invest in Incline, it's folks like insurance companies, pension funds. Yep. These are all groups that are looking to, increase the value of the investment, right? They've given us $1 and they want to see a meaningful return on that $1.
Sure.
And at the end of the day, that's our goal, right? Our mandate is to take an investment and make it grow and then return it to our investors. So as I think about our definition of success, we want to drive growth in the businesses in which we invest such that we can drive an economic outcome that's favorable for our investors. So for me, what that means is a definition of success requires having alignment with the team that we're investing with. So when we invest in a founder-owned business, oftentimes the founder is going to stay involved, whether that's remaining on as CEO, perhaps staying on as the board, perhaps rolling over some equity. That can mean that there could be a misalignment of incentives. The founder might say, I've enjoyed the pace of growth. I don't want to push too hard. I don't want to go on a broad a mergers and acquisition strategy. So we are always very transparent from the very first meeting with management. We say, let us understand your path to growth. Let us sit in a room and bounce ideas back and forth on how we would tactically execute on that path.
Okay.
Let us talk about timing goals. How long should it take us to do this? If this doesn't work, how are we going to pivot? What are we going to do to make sure that we're achieving everyone's goals? And if there's a misalignment, let's be very upfront and open about that. And if we can, find resolution, good. And if not, better not to partner with someone where they're not going to be happy, we're not going to be happy, and it's not going to end well. So that's a very long-winded answer to your question, Jonathan, but I think what I'm trying to get at is getting alignment is how we define success. I'm sorry, we define success. We lay out our plan for success, which is driving that favorable investment outcome. We get alignment on that. And then we, in conjunction with the management team, say, here's how we plan. Here's the strategy to get there. And if we're aligned there, then we're off to the races.
So, Joe, it sounds to me like if I had to distill what you just said, that your definition of success is really a healthy, vibrant, and sustainable company.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
Joe, from a PE perspective, from a PE firm perspective, can ERP implementations be risky? And if so, how? We talk about your vision of success, and it's about creating a healthy, investment into an organization with the return being a healthy, vibrant, sustainable company, which sometimes means implementing new systems in the form of ERP implementations. From your perspective, can those often be risky? And if so, how?
Yeah, Jack, that's right. ERP implementations, they're not easy. It is a true organizational change. Frequently, you scope it out and you say, here's the length of time we expect it to take. Here's what we expect it to cost. And those things can go over, right? You can miss the timeline. You can go over budget. Sometimes when you switch over to the new ERP, folks say, yeah, I went through all this training, but I can't remember how to do X, Y, or Z. Or you turn it on and it doesn't work immediately. So there absolutely are risks.
Joe, when we're talking about risks and change, one thing that almost always arises is conflict. There's so many different views on conflict. Some degree of it is considered good, some degree of it is considered detrimental, and there's so many different ways that it can be managed appropriately. I'm curious, what is your tolerance and view and approach for risk and conflict? And how does that relate to your approach around alignment?
Jonathan, I think that question marries well with some of the strategic questions we talked about earlier. And so I would argue that, to de-risk an ERP implementation or an ERP organizational change, you could spend a lot of money and you could take a lot of time. And by doing so, you could reduce the risk in an implementation. Of course, there's risk associated with that, right? It means you're taking a longer time to get the business intelligence you want.
Sure.
You're distracting the team, from the day-to-day operations for a longer period of time. You're, of course, incurring the cost and delaying the actual implementation. So we always think about it on, let's work with the experts. Let's work with the people in the company. Let's work with our implementation partner and find out at what point do we feel 95. I'm just arbitrarily picking numbers, but if we flip the switch today, we feel 95, 98% that things are going to work. There will be hiccups, but we're not going to cause damage to the business. And once we're at that point, we're like, okay, we're ready. We've gone through, we've aligned on strategy. We've spent the last several months working on execution. We have run tests. We feel good that when we flip the switch, we're going to be ready to go. We have a backup plan. Then at that point, has every single I been dotted and every T been crossed? Probably not. But the time and expense required to do that, to get that level of 99.5% as opposed to 98%, probably not worth it at that point. So let's go and, we'll have a team that's ready and nimble to handle the challenges, and we'll go forward from there. And as challenges arise, we'll tackle them.
So, Joe, what I'm hearing there is that risk and a conflict relate to a degree of certainty. And at some point, you're actually building in the assumption that that's going to happen. And so let's have the capacity to course correct. And that's a form of risk management.
That's it. I mean, it's not dissimilar from the investment world, right? In private equity, there's no sure bet. Every company we
Good point.
we're taking, we could take longer and spend more money on diligence, and we would never win a deal. But right, so at a certain point, you say, okay, we think we get it enough, right? We understand the risks, we understand the upside opportunities. It's time to either pull the trigger and work on this deal, or say this isn't a fit for us and don't.
So, Joe, based on your answer so far, I'm sensing that the absence of significant challenges is certainly not a prerequisite to ERP organizational change success. Or in other words, even the best of ERP organizational change efforts can encounter significant challenges. Is that a true statement?
Absolutely, Jack. I mean, if you go into an ERP organizational change thinking that it's going to be, 100% flawless, you're going to be disappointed. That's just not a reasonable expectation. I think reasonably you should expect challenges. You should plan for them. You should test as much as you can, right, reasonably. But working with someone who's kind of been there and done that, where you say, challenges are going to come up. I don't know exactly what challenge it's going to be, but whatever that challenge is, I'll have seen it. I've prepared for it. I have a plan to mitigate it, and I'm going to work through it. That's the key.
Joe, I want to switch a little bit of our lens here from the strategic lens to the people lens. From your experience, what are the main attributes or characters you see in an executive team that has successfully led organizational change, ERP or other technological systems, and really as a team become change leaders rather than just managers?
That's a good question, Jonathan. I think there are 2 points I'd like to highlight. Point one, a good team is going to have a strategic vision. And by that, it's not that there's the hill, go take the hill. It's which hill do we want to take? And I think you said it right. It's not just a manager. It's where do we want to go? What is our goal with this process? If the goal is we're just updating, upgrading an ERP because the old one's expired and it's time to do it, right? Like, that's not the right answer. The answer is we have a vision for this business, where it needs to go, where we want to take it. And in order to do that most effectively, we need to have a different set of tools in our toolkit. And that's why we're doing this implementation. That's one answer. The second attribute is flexibility. So you have a vision, you have a goal. You also have to realize that not everything goes exactly according to plan. You need to be nimble and ready to face these challenges and say, some things have gone well, some things haven't gone as well. What's the backup plan? What's the mitigant? What's the other opportunity, the other lever I'm going to pull if levers 1 and 2 don't work?
Joe, what about in the way they approach the process? Because flexibility and having a vision are two things. Is there anything on the tactics or the behaviors that those two things enable that you've seen any congruence in?
So yes and no. Well, I hope I'm addressing your question. I think that it's important that, having that vision and having the flexibility speaks to a culture of collaboration. If any one person thinks that they can speak for the organizational needs, you're probably going to have a challenge in the implementation. You need the various stakeholders having that, everyone has a different goal and a different desire. Everyone should have a voice at the table, all the strategic leaders of the business, the members of the executive leadership team, as well as, the sponsor. Having that melting pot of views so that you get the best outcome that will address the needs of the different groups and the different stakeholders, that's an important aspect that comes from having the vision and having the flexibility to allow the collaboration. I'm not sure if I answered your question.
Let's find out, because what I'm hearing is the behavior is actually recognizing that in order to get the best decision, not just buy-in, but to produce a qualitatively better decision, I need all of the perspectives, and that no one person can speak for that perspective. So the behavior is actually gathering those perspectives and letting the decision emerge from that.
That's right, Jonathan.
So, Joe, as a follow-up to that, to your answer and to Jonathan's summary, you actually had a quote in a Twitter post that I just love. You'd mentioned, quote, "We never claim to have the best answer, but we always strive to find the best answer, period, together, period," end quote. How do you go about that within Incline Equity?
That was a nice segue, Jack. I like that. At Incline, we always say we are not operators, right? I've never run a business. I'm an investor, not an operator. So I will never be the expert on what our companies do. That's what our management teams are. But as a firm, we have decades of experience working with similar types of issues, similar problems, similar challenges, and, candidly going after similar growth paths. So we can never tell the portfolio company exactly what the right answer is or what the right tactics are, but we can bounce strategies, leverage that experience to say, in other distribution businesses that have tried this angle, here's what worked and here's what didn't. We can leverage the Rolodex. So we view the company executives as the subject matter experts in the company and what the company does. Sure. And we view ourselves as a sounding board on strategy because we've done the same thing with so many different companies in a similar space.
Joe, that makes a lot of sense. I want to change the lens a little bit with a new type of question for our listeners. So this can be a little longer question. And this question is the stakeholder group challenge question. So Joe, I see stakeholder engagement and alignment that you've mentioned in this conversation as one of the most important and impactful parts of ERP and frankly, any organizational transformation. The risk of being unaware and mismanaging stakeholders, misunderstanding are so profound that in my experience, they can determine project success or project failure. Oftentimes, mismanagement of that turns into political turmoil, and there's so many stakeholder groups within any large transformation that not all stakeholders are the same, with varying degrees of influence, expectations, and general realities and skills and effect on the organizational change. All those roles and relationships are important to understand because it helps guide how we respond to what's happening in real time. And so with that background, what I'm really curious is Joe, how do you view and manage stakeholder alignment at all levels of scale?
stakeholder alignment comes from people feeling empowered and involved. So to that end, our goal is to make sure that the relevant groups have a voice at the table. We never say, hey, we're from the private equity firm. We're telling you what to do, and this is what we're doing. That's not our goal. That's not a partnership. Our goal is to say, we'd love to hear your ideas to grow the business. Let's bat those ideas around. Let's have a healthy, spirited debate. And everyone has a voice at the table. Everyone needs to feel the comfort to speak up, to be heard, where we never say, you're wrong because we know better. That's never the outcome. It's always, we agree with this part of your strategy. We disagree with that part. And here's why. And tell us if we're wrong. So it's having that voice at the table, having the ability for everyone to contribute that then results in the alignment of interest. And when everyone feels that they've had a hand in crafting the view and crafting the strategy, we have much better luck on getting the stakeholder alignment.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And so you craft the process to actually gather those perspectives with the belief that process is going to inherently support alignment in the discussion. Is that right?
That's right. That's exactly right.
Joe, so a question for you to change topics here just slightly. After you go live, there usually tends to be a dip in productivity. The time, money, and effort required after you hit the switch, so to speak, with the ERP implementation go live creates a post go live productivity dip. Is that a reality or is that a myth?
Jack, don't beat me up, but it's a reality. I think for us, the answer is, look, as we talked about earlier, there are going to be challenges. If you think otherwise, you're being a little bit too optimistic. The reality is you'll have a dip. The key to success is how is that dip managed? Can you quickly find the root cause of the issues, come up with solutions that work within the context of the change, right? So not some workaround that makes you more efficient, but actually whether that's changing the way behaviors or changing the solution. That's the key. It's managing what caused the dip, managing the problem, and implementing a fix quickly so that it doesn't become a larger part of the go forward operations.
Sure. So next, Joe, I want to walk through an exercise with you, so bear with me. I'm just curious to get your feedback. So I want to share something with you that I've actually learned from my own work, which was specifically in the context of private equity. And there appear to be some common denominators within private equity in terms of ERP organizational change. And these weren't just common denominators. These were pretty prominent influences, I would say, upon the success. So please allow me to read these. And then maybe, if you would, please highlight any that really catches your attention. Or even if you find one not to be true, if you would, and then speak to that. So I'm going to list 7 or 8 points here really quick. And then if you could just respond to one of these, that would be great. So one of the influences is the value of reflection. There seems to be a lot of discussion around lessons learned, even with the executive leadership team, a lot of discussion and reflection around lessons learned with each ERP organizational change experience. The next one was promising practice organizations. They were extremely persistent. The next point is positive culture and behavior is important for ERP organizational change, to the point where it's not treated as a buzzword. They actually do something about it tactically. The next point is success not only varies with time, but can also improve more and more over time. The next point, the organization needs an ERP-specific formal learning and education program with executive participation. The next point is organizations need team diversity due to its impact on organizational performance. And the organizations also need to understand how to manage team diversity. And by diversity on that, Joe, I'm referring to knowledge, experience, value diversity, that type of diversity. And the next point is the organization needs a culture of transformational leadership. So very much rooted in how the executive team kind of guides the organization through that transformation. And then just 3 more points. The next one is the organization needs a culture of trust and constructive conflict. The next one, the organization needs a general culture of sharing and learning. A lot of the organizations that I studied actually had pretty formal, very deliberate, and very intentional tactical approaches to sharing and learning. And then lastly, Joe, all successful ERP organizational change projects experience significant challenges. So that was a mouthful. That was quite the list. But do you have any of those you want to respond to or add to or disagree with?
Jack, you've never accused me of being a man of few words. So even though you asked me to respond to one, if you don't mind, I'm going to respond to two.
Absolutely. Please do.
And I could keep going, but I'll try to limit it. The two that really resonated, and one I would say is a little bit more sort of strategic, and one is a little bit more tactical.
Sure.
The first one is, I believe it was positive culture and behavior is important for ERP and organizational change. That one just resonated with me very strongly. I would not try to, go through an ERP organizational change unless there had been sort of a concurrent, unless the culture is already there, or if we had, spent 6 months to a year making sure the culture is there ahead of time.
Sure.
That is paramount to the success, in my opinion. Without having folks bought in and believing in it and saying, yes, I understand why we're doing this, and I'm going to participate, and I'm aligned. Without that, success is going to be a challenge.
Sure.
And the second one, which is a little bit more tactical, but it's that the organization needs an ERP-specific formal learning and education program with executive participation.
Mm-hmm.
But two parts there. I'd highlight the executive participation. Sometimes people say, okay, we're doing an ERP implementation. That's the guy in IT's problem. And if that's the start, that's also the end. Because,
there you go.
Right.
That just does not work. As we've talked about this entire conversation, you need all the different stakeholders to understand what's happening, to have a perspective on what the goals need to be, and have input on that for this to work. And that ties back, and that's why I said it was tactical. You need to have that ERP-specific learning and education program. You need everyone to understand, here's why we're doing it, here's what we're doing, and here's what this change means to you. Here's how this is going to make your life different, hopefully better in most ways, and here's how we're going to track that.
Sure.
Those 2 points just resonated very strongly with me.
Joe, this has been an awesome conversation, and this is one of my favorite, if not my favorite question to ask. So it's a great conversation when I get to ask this. Joe, if you had to distill your years of experience, expertise, and success, and your challenges into 4 or 5 sentences to offer to our listeners about ERP, organizational change, PE, and to our practitioners in the field, and that's PE executives, organizational change, ERP practitioners, what would you tell them about how to produce organizational change and ERP project success? What to look for, what to do, and what to be?
That is a big question. But,
I told you it's my favorite to ask.
I will do my best to distill it down. So I think item 1, it is alignment on strategy, right? I mean, that's paramount across all these things. When every investment where I feel like we've had success, every initiative with an investment where we've had success, we've had very good alignment on strategy. By that, it's the key stakeholders of the company, it's us as the sponsors, it's the stakeholders of the company. So management team, customers, vendors, the whole shebang, right? Everyone needs to be aligned. 2, and this marries closely with the strategy, is as you develop a plan for execution, have flexibility, be ready to pivot. Every single thing we do, right? Like nothing is static, right? We live in a very dynamic world. Things are changing all the time. We uncover new risks. We find new opportunities. You need to be ready to flex to, mitigate the risks and take advantage of the opportunities. And last, just to kind of bring it all together, it's including those key stakeholders, and whether that's by including them in the conversation or thinking about their perspectives. Because of course, right, you're not necessarily going to reach out to your customers and say, hey, here's something we're doing as an organization. What do you think? You may or may not, but you still want to think about their voice and their perspective so that the changes you're making have a holistic view throughout the organization and the investment, not just, the people who are in the room.
So, Joe, it sounds like the first is strategy, is the core piece. What about the behavior? Is there anything on the behavior side of that question that you want to add or think is relevant?
On the behavior side, for us, it's always a bias for action. So
okay.
we talk about planning, we talk about executing. It's, don't wait until you've analyzed every single outcome, because at that point it might be too late. Reach the conclusion, but say, my goal is to have a strategy to do something, in a certain time frame. Come to a conclusion and then execute on it. And if you don't feel comfortable, figure out why. But you can't kind of overanalyze. So that would be the behavioral point. It's always have that bias to execute.
That's so helpful. Thank you so much, Joe.
Yeah, what an awesome and insightful conversation. We could take any of these questions we've asked you and sit here and pick your brain for an hour on just one of these questions. But thank you so much. What a fun conversation. We appreciate it. And thanks, and be well, and we'll talk soon.
Thank you.
Please join us in our next episode as we discuss Slow Down to Speed Up, Lead, Succeed, and Thrive in a 24/7 World with Dr. Liz Bywater. Dr. Liz Bywater is an author, thought leader, speaker, leadership and team accelerator coach, and consultant, and Nestell & Associates strategic advisor. Dr. Liz Bywater is a one-of-a-kind leadership expert who works at the intersection of business and psychology. Liz combines deep expertise in human behavior and organizational effectiveness. She has a pragmatic mindset and has an engaging personal style to help her clients excel in an increasingly complex world. Liz works with senior executives in Fortune 500 companies, and she brings a rapidly actionable framework for success, which is captured in her new book and the title of this episode, Slow Down to Speed Up, Lead, Succeed, and Thrive in a 24/7 World. Liz also writes a monthly column for Life Science Leader and provides expert commentary to the Wall Street Journal, Fast Company, Fierce CEO, and other top media outlets. Liz additionally sits on an editorial advisory board for Life Science Leader and has been featured as a guest on CBS's Philadelphia Agenda and Remarkable Woman. She's a popular speaker and longstanding member of the American Psychology Association, Society for the Advancement of Consulting, and $1 Million Consulting Hall of Fame. We hope you join us again next week for a rich and fun conversation.
Listeners, thank you for joining us on today's episode. We are incredibly excited and grateful to have friends, colleagues, and mentors join us on our podcast. We have an incredible lineup of guests, including ERP and organizational change speakers, authors, professors, researchers, pioneers in the field, practitioners, PE partners, business executives, ERP vendors, and organizational stakeholders. We invite you to leave us feedback and a review because we want to make this the most useful and insightful podcast you listen to, and we need your help to do so.
Thank you, listeners, for being with us again this week as we seek to, 1, promote, connect, and foster relationships in the ERP organizational change community, 2, contribute to the field of ERP organizational change, and 3, bring research and practice closer together. Please join us again next week as we discuss the latest ERP organizational change research, practice, and stories. Our podcast will draw on knowledge from extensive research, collaborative learning, and practitioner expertise and experience.
From everyone here on the team, Jack and myself, we wish you a great week, and we hope to see you again soon on another episode.
Hashtag the ERP Organizational Change Journal. Have a fantastic week. Bye for now.